Hello and welcome again. In this lesson, we'll be having an introduction to um, creating a REST API using Express. I'm still going to be using the folder we used in the last lesson in creating our Express application. You can see the code is still the same. So, first of all, what we want to do is to have a mock database. Specifically, we want to have a JSON file that contains a list of users, and we want to interact with that data with using our routes. So first of all, I'm going to head over to the JSON placeholder.typical.com/users route, which we used in a couple of lessons earlier, to fetch a list of users. And we're just going to copy, I'm just going to copy all of this and paste it in a new file here. Let's just call this users.json, and then I'm going to paste this here and save it. So I have a list of users which we can now use as our database, just a mock database for now, and then we can interact with this data from our API. So before we move further, I would like to run you through some conventions that are used in the REST API protocol. For example, in this current project, we are dealing with users. We are trying to fetch users, we're trying to create users, we're trying to update existing users, we're trying to fetch existing users and probably delete existing users. So the way the convention works in REST API is that my routes are going to in a way be descriptive enough to tell what each route does. For example, if my request path is /users, that means that what I'm trying to do, or the request I'm trying to make to the API, has to deal with the user resource. So that would cover creating users, fetching users, fetching a single user, updating a single user, deleting a single user. So most of what we would do are within this scope. These kind of operations are generally referred to as CRUD operations. CRUD stands for create, read, updates, and deletes. And this will characterize many of what we'll be doing with our routes. So back to this, like I said, the naming convention in a way describes what the route is supposed to do, or what to expect from that route or endpoint. And then the HTTP request method defines exactly what the route does. For example, for creating users, the usual convention would be to send a post request to /users. To fetch all users, conventionally I will just send a GET request to /users. To fetch a single user, I would be sending a GET request to /users ID, you would notice that I have a colon in front of the ID. This colon in front of it makes it a request parameter or params, and whatever I fill in after these users will be matched as an ID or whatever variable I call this. This would explain why, for example, if I were to visit Twitter and I say twitter.com/ let's say Jack, it sends a request to fetch a single user whose username is Jack, right? So this could very well be something like username on Twitter, and so whatever I fill in here, Twitter is going to handle it as a username variable. The same way I can say Reskill America, and the route does not change, so to say it is just handling this last part of the path as a variable. So in that very same way, we would be handling the ID of the users as a variable, and so when we send the get request to /users/ this ID, this ID is going to be any parameter that is passed here will be treated as a potential ID for a particular user. The same thing to update a single user, I would be using the put request, sending it to /users/ID, and then delete. I'm going to use the delete request method /users/ID. So this is the scope of what we'll be doing in the next couple of minutes. And so we'll be creating users, fetching a single user, updating and deleting. So let's start with fetching, so we see how that goes. So to fetch, I'm going to create a route like we described here, app.get/users, and then this time I'm going to use an arrow function, request response, and inside of this I'm going to fetch all users, and then I'm going to send the user array as response to the client. So to fetch all users, I'm going to have to require this JSON file. I would prefer to require it at the top here, so, and save it to a variable, and I'll just say const users equals require. Since they are in the same directory, I'm just going to say ./users.json, and so I have these users here, and then I can interact with the data in this JSON file through this variable here. So now that I have the users here, I can just send back this array of users as the response to the client. So all I'll just do is to say return rest dots. Okay, so before now we've only done rest.send, but now I'm going to use another one called rest.json. This will send back the response in a JSON object format. So the response is going to look like this: users, which is the key, and then the value, or sorry, users, which is this variable here. Or I could just use the shorthand form and just say rest.json users. I'm going to save this and restart my server. my server is up and running. Then I'm going to open Postman and create a new tab, and then enter the URL http localhost 3000/users, and I get the array of users as you can see here, and this works quite correctly. Alright, so let's move to the next part, which is to create a new user. Now I said to create a new user, we're going to use the post request to /users. So I'm going to create a new route, app.posts/users, and then request response. And what we want to do is create a new user, and that new user we're creating is going to be based off what the client sends to the API. So create a new user from client requests, save new user. There should be a comment, save new user to existing database. Then we want to send back a response to clients. Alright, so the first thing we will do is to create a new user from the client request. What that means is that for the client to send, or for us to create a new user, the client has to send an object, or rather data, that describes the properties of the new user that is to be created, and preferably that has to match what we have here already, this format. So what that means is that the client's interface, this time our Postman, we're going to use Postman to send data structured like this to the API, and then this from the server we are going to create a new user, which is basically just adding a new object to this array, and then saving this file again, and then we send back response to the client. So let's get on with that. And let me add one more line here, save new data, or rather save updated data to users.json, and then send back a response to client. So let's see how that gets handled. To send a post request, you have to select post as the request method here, and then to input the data that will be sent to the API, the data that is going to be received by the client is usually sent through the request body. The body is a property of the request object that contains information sent by the client to the server, most especially using a post request or a put request. These are different forms that data is expected to come through. So sometimes it could be through form data, which also includes when you want to upload files. It could be through the URL encoded formats. It could be a raw format, which could be just plain text, or JavaScript, or JSON, or HTML, or XML. It could be a binary file. It could be GraphQL. But this time we'll just stick with using raw data, and specifically JSON. So to do this, I'm going to copy one of the user objects we have here, and then just modify it to something new, and then we'll send that request. So I'm going to paste that here, and I'm going to leave out, or I'm going to give the user an ID. Ideally, I should not be giving this user an ID, but for now I'm just going to give it an ID manually since we're not using the database yet. The last number here is 10, so manually for now I'll just give it an ID 11. The name is going to be new user, username will be new user, email will be newuser@mail.org, address will be Finiki Mall. Let's just leave some of this the way it is. Let's say North Elvis, zip code. Let's just leave some of this. Website, new user .biz, company name, scale, America, catchphrase, let's just rescale, BS. Okay, let's leave this the way it is. And okay, so there we have it, almost complete. There seems to be a syntax error here. Okay, the trailing comma should not be there. Alright, so we're good to go. Now if I send this post request, you should know that nothing will happen just yet. However, we do want to capture the data coming from the client's request. Like I mentioned the other time, data coming from the client request is usually stored or expected from the request.body. Let's read through that part in the Express documentation. I have here request.body, and you can see it contains key value pairs of data submitted in the request body. By default, it is undefined and is populated when you use body parsing middlewares such as express.json or express.url encoded. And to do that, it says we have to use this middleware. So that means that for us to use the post request, we have to use one or both of these middlewares so that our the data sent through the client can be received in the request body. So I'm going to head over to index.js, and on this line here I'm going to say app.use express.json, and then that gives me the ability to send JSON data, raw JSON data, to the API and expect it to be in the request body. If I use the app.use express.url encoded, this means that I can now send URL encoded bodies to the API. Okay, so I'm going to leave these two so we can use either of each of them and use that in our requests. So right here, I just wanted to see how it looks. I'm just going to console.log requests.body, just so you see what is received from the client requests. I'm going to restart my server and send this, and if I go back to my console, we can see what is in the request.body here, all of what we sent as the request body in JSON format. Now watch what happens if I take out any of these middlewares here. If I take out this or let me take out both so you see what happens. I'm saving this and restarting my server, and if I try sending this again and I want to check what request.body is, you can see it says undefined. And if I take this and I still leave expert.json out and I restart the server, you would still see that my request body is an empty object, no longer undefined, because now it knows what request.body is, but it cannot find the data sent as JSON. So I'm just going to release this now and then restart the server, and if I make the request now, you can see that request.body is rightly populated. So now that we can rightly get data from the client, now we can use this data to create a new user and save that user in the users array. Alright, so what we'll do now is to send this properly. I'm going to cancel this request, and then I'm going to send it as this. I would say new user, is this object, and I'm going to close the brackets here, so that when we send the request again, you can see that request.body now is now an object that contains new user, and we know that new user is an object. So in our requests and response handler, we can now say console.log request.body dot, let's say, new user, and that will be the object that is being sent, this object. So what we want to do is save that new user to the existing database. So what we would do to add this new user is to just say users dot push request dot body dot new user, and when that is done, you would expect that the data is updated, but no, the data that is updated is this users variable that we declared here and not this file. So let's just experiment and see how that works out. I'm going to console.log the users array that we have here, and then we're going to manually check the users.json file to see if there were any changes. I'm going to save this now, and then I'm going to say console.log users, and also let's just send back a response to the clients res.json and just send a message that says new user created, and I'm going to cancel this. Okay, I'm going to restart my server, and then I'm going to send this request, and it says message new user created. Okay, let's check our console. You can see that the new user was indeed added to the array, but let's check our users.json file. You'd see that nothing was added because this is a file and we have to manually make that update. Okay, but for now we will not bother ourselves with making updates to the file. We're just going to be satisfied with using this object here, this array rather of users here. Okay, so the users array is updated correctly, and we have our users being logged to the console. Okay, so also we should be mindful of the status code that is sent back to the user. This status code is meant to tell the client the state of the response received. So it could be a success response, it could be a failure, it could be an error, there could be an internal server error, something could have gone wrong somewhere. So we should handle all of those errors and give the client a reliable response to handle. So we'll do that by saying rest.status 200.json. Yes, and that should just be it. So finally, on the post request, let's save the updated data to users.json. So to do that, I'm going to require the fs module, and to save the updated data, I'm going to stringify the JSON data and then rewrite the file users.json and then send back a response to the client. So what that means is that this users array here is now updated, right, when we push this to it. So we will now take the whole of this new list and then write it to this file and save this file. So we'll just simply do that by saying let's stringed data be equal to json.stringify users, and when we've done that, we just want to say fs.writeFileSync. Path will be users.json. Okay, I do not want to use writeFileSync. I want to use just the write file, and then the data will be stringed data, and then the callback function will just take in an error as parameter, and if there's an error, we want to send it back to the clients so that the client knows there was an error. So I'll just say return rest.status 500, which would be an internal server error, so which would describe that the error is not coming from the user's request but from the server's handling of the request. So .json, and the message will just be the error that we found, and if there's no error, we'll just return rest.status 200.json new user created. Okay, yes, I'm not going to forget that null 2, just so that our string data is well indented. I'm going to restart the server now and make the post request again, and there's no error. We have new user created, and when we open users.json, we can see the new user rightly written here. Okay, great. Now let's move on to the next one, which will be fetching a single user, and our path will be like this: /users/id. And so I'm going to create a new route here, fetch single user, this is create new user, and I'm just going to say okay, just so that the code is readable. And so to fetch a single user, I'm going to say app.get /users/id. Like I mentioned earlier, the ID here is now retrievable in the request.params object. Let's read a little on that here. Request.params. This property is an object containing properties mapped to the named route parameters. So for example, if you have the route user name, then the name property is available as request.params.name. So let's break that down. So if I say app.get /user/id and my request.response, and for now let's see what we have when I console.log request.params dot our variable here id, and let's see what we get from there. I'm going to restart the server here, and now I'm going to make a get request to /users/ let's make the ID just some gibberish, and if you check, oh, I do not have something configured here. App.get, okay, okay, I'm going to restart my server again, and oh right, my mistake was here /users, and I'm going to again restart my server and then send this. Okay, now you would see that request.params.id gives me the exact text I have after users here, because I named this route to have this parameter. So this parameter is going to be a variable, whatever the client fills in that matches this format, this whatever comes after here will be treated as the request parameter. So if I do the same thing and I say /1, let's update this so that you can see what kind of data we are receiving. So I'm just going to say params is this, and restart the server and send. You can see params is always going to be a string 1. So string 1, and then you can see it. So this is how it's going to work. So that means that we can specify an ID and then fetch the user who has that ID, and then we don't have to create a route for every user. We just need to have a parameter that we can match. Great. So I'm going to come back here and say I'm going to first fetch request.params.id. I'm going to find user with that ID, return user object as response, and if for any reason we can't find the user, return a 404 error. 404 error simply means the resource was not found. Error if user is not found. And so let's go with this. Now the first thing I'm going to do is say let id equals request.params.id, and then we want to find the user whose ID matches this ID. So we can do this in a number of methods. We can use a loop, but I think the most efficient I can think of now is to use an array.find method. And an array.find method is simply like this: array.find, and this is going to take a callback function, and it's going to take in a parameter, and it would return the first element in that array that matches this condition, whatever condition I specify here. So if I would replicate that here, that would be users, which is the array we have over here, and users.find, and I want it to return the user whose ID is equal to request.params.id. I'm going to save this, although we're going to run into a little problem because I'm using the triple equal sign here, which means it will match both the value and the type. And if I just want to handle that, I would just say to force both to be strings, and just like that. This is already going to be a string, so I'll just make this a string, and that should work well. So I would save this as a variable rather. Let's found user be equal to users.find this, and for now let's just console.log found user. I'm going to restart the server, and then I'm going to make this 1, and on my console you can see it fetches the user whose ID is 1. I can cancel this and make this 11, and there you can see we have the user with the ID 11. So what we want to do is to send back this user object as a response to the client. So we're going to just say return res.status 200.json user is the found user, and I'm going to restart my server. And then if I send this, you can see my response now comes out correctly. The user is the found user. I can fetch /1/2 and keep going on and on. What if I search for 300, which I know does not exist? I get an empty object with a 200 status code. So we want to handle that correctly by returning a 404 error if the user was not found. So the array.find method would either return an array element or return undefined. So what I'm going to do is to say if there's a found user, return this, else return res.status 404.json message user not found. I'm going to save this and restart my server, and then send this again, and it sends back a 404 not found error, and this is just how we would handle our response. So I hope you've been able to understand how REST API works and how we create our routes and the conventions around it. And I'll see you in another lesson. Goodbye.